A quiet evening at the palace turns into an emotional battlefield. With senior royals gathered around the dining table, all eyes were on one small act of respect. But what unfolded instead was a silent rebellion that rippled through the room. Princess Charlotte refused to curtsy to Queen Camilla. Gasps followed. Tension thickened. And in that moment, the family's fate began to unravel. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The grand dining hall of Windsor Castle had seen its fair share of ceremonies and strained smiles. But tonight, the atmosphere crackled with something different. A subtle unease hung over the table as Charles III presided at the head, his expression carved in polished neutrality. Queen Camilla, dressed in regal poise, maintained her customary composure, yet her eyes scanned the table with calculated precision. Seated beside Catherine, Princess of Wales, was her daughter Princess Charlotte, now no longer a child hidden behind royal protocol, but a young royal aware of her surroundings, her legacy, and, most importantly, her worth. As the moment came, an expected formality, the air shifted. Queen Camilla leaned slightly, clearly anticipating the curtsy owed to her by royal custom. It was a motion the young Charlotte had performed countless times before. But tonight, she didn't move. Instead, she stood tall, her chin slightly raised, her eyes unwavering as they met Camilla's. The silence that followed was louder than any gasp. Camilla's expression tightened, the temperature in the room dropping with every second that passed without movement. There was no confusion in Charlotte's eyes. It wasn't forgetfulness. It was a choice. Catherine's response was even more unexpected. She didn't rush in to correct her daughter. She didn't issue a quiet command. She placed a firm hand on Charlotte's shoulder and offered a serene, almost knowing smile. That single gesture sent an unspoken message across the table: Charlotte would not be reprimanded. The message was not lost on Camilla, nor on Charles. Around them, the royal attendees froze in discomfort, unsure whether to intervene, observe, or pretend not to notice. This wasn't just a broken tradition. It was a spark. A small, unspoken challenge lit under the roof of the monarchy itself. What began as an ordinary dinner among the most powerful figures in Britain quickly unraveled into a confrontation of allegiances and influence. This wasn't a tale of childish rebellion, it was something far more calculated, born of observation and emotional inheritance. Charlotte, a witness to more than most would assume, had delivered a gesture that pierced through the carefully maintained illusion of unity. And Catherine, in that moment, made it clear to all present that her daughter's instinct had not been a mistake, it had been a statement. Whispers began the moment dinner plates were cleared, yet no one dared speak of it outright. Not yet. But beneath the surface, one thing had become unmistakably clear. Something had shifted. Power no longer belonged solely to titles or crowns, it now pulsed in the veins of those who remembered, who questioned, who refused. Charlotte's refusal would not be forgotten, because in the House of Windsor, where legacy is everything, even the smallest act of defiance can echo louder than any declaration. But this wasn't a mere moment of childhood rebellion, it was a carefully lit fuse that would ignite years of hidden grievances and generational divides within the monarchy. Princess Charlotte may be young, but within palace walls, even children grow up fast. What does she know that made her defy tradition? Who has whispered truths in her ear? Behind her innocent eyes lies knowledge tales of betrayal, loss, and quiet suffering. And they all lead back to one name: Camilla. Long before that fateful dinner, long before the curtsy that never came, Charlotte had already begun piecing together the unspoken truths that threaded through her family's legacy. In the private corners of royal life, where public image fades and reality emerges, she had witnessed moments not meant for young eyes, tense silences between her mother and Camilla, quiet glances that spoke of wounds not yet healed. It wasn't the grand gestures Charlotte remembered, but the subtle slights: Camilla's dismissive tone, her calculated timing to overshadow Catherine's appearances, the cold way she sometimes dominated conversations, as if asserting a crown that hadn't been fully earned. Charlotte noticed. She always noticed. Nannies and palace staff whispered behind closed doors, often assuming Charlotte was too young or too distracted to comprehend. But it was during one such hushed exchange that she first heard the name Diana spoken not as a legend, but as a woman flawed, wounded, betrayed. The legacy of her late grandmother wasn't just told in fairy tales or framed portraits, it lingered in the hesitations of those who had known her. In the reverent way her name carried weight long after she was gone. One staff member later confided to another that Charlotte had begun asking questions. Why did Granny Diana cry? Why didn't she live in the palace? Did Camilla make Mummy sad? Those innocent questions revealed a mind that was trying to make sense of something far greater than herself. In the rare but raw moments when Catherine returned from engagements, her composed exterior would sometimes fracture just for a moment. Charlotte saw the way her mother's shoulders tensed after standing beside Camilla at official events. She saw her quietly retreat to their private rooms, William always close behind, offering comfort that never required words. To outsiders, the Princess of Wales remained serene, poised, unshaken. But Charlotte saw more. And she began to understand the cost of that serenity. In the sanctuary of their home, William and Catherine often spoke in guarded tones. Yet Charlotte listened closely. Conversations about the crown, about navigating duty and deception, were layered with subtext. She learned that in this family, silence could protect, but it could also erase. Her parents tried to shield her from the deeper wounds of royal life, but truth always finds its way in. From whispered arguments behind closed doors to William's moments of reflection, Charlotte absorbed not only the past but the unspoken fears for the future. Her bond with her mother deepened through those quiet observations. Catherine was not merely a mother, she was a survivor, a woman navigating a battlefield disguised in pearls and etiquette. And Charlotte, fiercely loyal, began to understand that protecting her mother meant more than simply obeying rules. It meant recognizing where those rules had failed others, especially Diana. The late princess's presence haunted the palace in quiet ways, and Charlotte, too young to have known her, felt her absence more powerfully than anyone could have predicted. By the time the family dinner arrived, Charlotte's refusal to curtsy wasn't spontaneous. It was a silent vow. A culmination of years watching, learning, and choosing. In a family where tradition demands submission, Charlotte had made a different choice. One rooted in loyalty, pain, and a promise to herself that she would never forget what her mother endured or who had caused it. As the royal staff scrambled to interpret the fallout, another figure quietly observed the moment, and he knew exactly what was coming next. The king didn't speak, but his silence screamed. His eyes locked onto Charlotte, then Catherine. His jaw clenched. What began as a dinner became a throne room in disguise, and Charles III, cornered by loyalty and legacy, had no choice but to reckon with a child's rebellion. In the stillness that followed Charlotte's quiet refusal, Charles found himself caught in a familiar trap, one where duty and emotion wrestled beneath the surface. As monarch, he was expected to uphold tradition without hesitation. As grandfather, he was witnessing the kind of defiance that mirrored a ghost from his past. The weight of the crown pressed heavier than usual that evening, and not just because of protocol. It was the echo of history knocking at his door, louder and more demanding than ever. Charlotte's defiance was more than a breach of etiquette, it was a message. One that cut through generations and dragged Charles back into the shadow of Diana. He knew the implications immediately. Camilla had worked for decades to be accepted. Her presence beside him no longer contested publicly, but not universally embraced, either. Her title was hard-won, wrapped in compromise and silent resentment. And now, with one gesture, Charlotte had reopened a wound Charles had fought years to bury. There was a flicker of panic behind his stoic expression. He could feel the old whispers rising again of Diana's tears, of the infamous tapes, of a kingdom divided between sympathy and scandal. He had climbed out of that abyss once. He wasn't sure the monarchy could survive falling back in. And still, he hesitated. Not because he didn't know what to do, but because he knew exactly what was expected, and he wasn't sure he had the strength to deliver it. To correct Charlotte would be to publicly reprimand his granddaughter and indirectly challenge Catherine, whose popularity among the public had long eclipsed that of Camilla. To remain silent risked undermining Camilla's position again. Either path fractured something. The walls of the palace weren't built to contain rebellion from within, especially not from a child who bore Diana's fire in her veins. Camilla, across the table, gave nothing away with her expression. But Charles could feel the heat of her unspoken demand. Her eyes didn't waver. She had endured too much humiliation to let this moment slide. To her, it wasn't about Charlotte's age, it was about the authority that had been silently mocked, the fragile balance that had just been publicly shaken. She needed Charles to act. She needed a sign that he still believed in her right to rule beside him. But Charles hesitated, and in that hesitation, cracks began to form. There was another fear simmering beneath the surface. The fear that Catherine had not only approved of Charlotte's gesture, but possibly guided it. It was unspoken, but Charles felt it in her posture, in her refusal to apologize or retreat. Catherine's influence had grown steadily, subtly, and now he wondered if she was orchestrating something much larger than a dinner protest. Was this the beginning of a silent campaign to reposition the monarchy's heart? Was this the first step in a quiet dethroning of Camilla's legacy? The entire table remained suspended in unease, each member of the family pretending to focus on their meal, yet clearly gripped by the unfolding tension. The press hadn't seen it, but the staff had. And in the royal household, nothing stays secret for long. Charles understood the media storm that loomed just beyond the castle gates. A child's rebellion may seem small, but when that child is royal, the world listens, speculates, and spins narratives that can't easily be undone. And the image of a grandfather paralyzed in the face of it would be unforgiving. But Catherine didn't flinch, and her calm defiance said more than any royal decree ever could. She didn't rise. She didn't scold. Instead, Catherine, Princess of Wales, placed her hand on Charlotte's arm and smiled. It was a mother's smile, but beneath it burned decades of repression, loyalty tested, and alliances formed in silence. For the first time, Catherine chose to protect her daughter over preserving royal tradition. That simple gesture, a hand, a smile, a silence, was anything but passive. It was Catherine's declaration. In that charged moment, her instincts as a mother overpowered her training as a royal. She had played the long game for years, carefully navigating palace politics, smiling when she wanted to scream, bowing when it hollowed her out. But as she watched her daughter resist a system that had often bruised without breaking her, something shifted inside her. Catherine had endured the weight of expectation in silence. But now, watching Charlotte face the same storm, she chose differently. She would not let the next generation carry the same invisible scars. The flashbacks came uninvited times when she herself had dropped into curtsies before Camilla with a forced grace, not out of reverence but necessity. The stinging knowledge that despite her unwavering composure, she was always one step behind. Always second in the shadow of a woman whose past was steeped in controversy. And the palace had made it clear Camilla was queen now. Catherine had to fall in line. But falling in line came at a cost. And that cost had been Catherine's voice. Now, in Charlotte's resistance, she saw a mirror of her own buried defiance, and it reignited her strength. This wasn't just about one moment. This was about every moment Catherine had endured in silence. The subtle slights, the orchestrated photo ops where Camilla took center stage while Catherine remained in the margins. The countless times her loyalty was expected, never earned. And now, her daughter had drawn a line. Not in rebellion, but in quiet truth. Catherine's smile to Charlotte was more than approval, it was permission. Permission to feel discomfort, to question, to assert herself. "You are allowed to feel," that smile said. "You are not wrong." The rest of the family read it clearly. Catherine's refusal to correct Charlotte wasn't missed. If anything, it amplified the moment, made it intentional. The Queen was not just denied a curtsy, she was publicly denied reverence. The message was unmistakable. And Camilla's eyes did not waver from Catherine. It wasn't rage that filled the room. It was a chilling calculation. The woman once underestimated had just reminded everyone that silence was not weakness, it was restraint. And tonight, that restraint had been lifted. Catherine's inner life, so often concealed, had never been more exposed. To the public, she remained the composed figure in pearls and modest smiles. But in private, she had battled through emotional storms the world would never see. Her journey wasn't one of privilege alone, it was a lesson in endurance. And now, the silent allegiance she shared with her daughter had formed the beginnings of a new kind of resistance. Not one marked by revolution, but by presence. Strength wrapped in stillness. It wasn't just a smile. It was a reckoning. A choice that told the royal family and the public that Catherine, once the palace's most dutiful figure, had found a new center of power, motherhood without compromise. But not everyone saw Charlotte's gesture as noble defiance. Some saw it as dangerous insubordination. Trapped between the throne and his own kitchen table, William, Prince of Wales, found himself cornered. As husband, he felt pride. As father, he understood. But as heir, he feared the storm Charlotte may have just summoned upon them all. The silence that followed Charlotte's defiance gripped William more tightly than anyone at the table could see. He hadn't anticipated it. Not from her, and certainly not there. He watched as his daughter stood her ground, as Catherine stood beside her, and as the weight of the monarchy's unspoken laws came crashing into their family dynamic. In that breathless pause, William felt his worlds collide, the one he had built with his wife and children, and the one he had inherited, bound by blood and duty. There was no time to react, but there was no escape either. He was a prince. He was the future king. And now he was a father navigating a royal rebellion that struck far closer than any scandal before. His instincts told him to protect them, to protect Charlotte, to protect Catherine. His heart whispered that this moment had been years in the making. But another voice, the one trained and rehearsed by decades of monarchy, warned him of the consequences. He thought back to the late-night conversations he'd had with Charles. Conversations where succession was discussed not just as a formality, but a delicate operation. Camilla's role had always been a sore point, one William never fully accepted, but learned to endure for the sake of unity. Charles had made it clear, perception was everything. Loyalty to Camilla, no matter how thinly veiled, was a price they all had to pay to preserve the family's image. But now that fade was splintering, and William's silence was being watched as closely as his daughter's defiance. Diana's face drifted into his memory, not the public icon, but the woman who once whispered to him in hushed tones about the loneliness of being royal, about how truth could be a weapon and a shield. He remembered how the institution she married into devoured her spirit and mocked her emotions. And now, it felt like that very machinery was being challenged again, but this time by a girl with Diana's courage and Catherine's quiet fire. William knew the dangers. He had seen what happened when someone dared to push too far. The monarchy never forgot, and it rarely forgave. The question that twisted inside him wasn't whether Charlotte had been right, but whether he could survive defending her. Should he take her aside, urge caution, remind her of the family she was born into? Or should he shield her from the reckoning that was surely coming? His hesitation was deafening. To some, it looked like approval. To others, weakness. But in truth, it was the paralysis of a man who knew that no matter what he chose, someone would bleed. And perhaps, the wound would be his own. That night, when the palace lights dimmed and the public saw nothing but still photos of smiles and tradition, William sought his father in private. Their exchange wasn't heated, it was cold, deliberate. William asked what the expectations were. Charles responded with silence, the kind that didn't demand answers but reminded him of the crown waiting in the shadows. William walked away from that conversation more uncertain than ever, not about Charlotte, but about the path he was being forced down. And in that uncertainty, the cracks beneath the surface of the monarchy widened. But Camilla didn't wait for William to act. She had already begun a quiet campaign of her own. She didn't shout. She didn't scold. She moved in silence, through courtiers and corridors, tightening the noose one whisper at a time. For Camilla, this wasn't just about respect, it was about survival. And she would not allow a child or her mother to threaten the crown she bled to wear. In the hours after the dinner, as the palace attempted to move on as if nothing had happened, Camilla was already in motion. The queen had long learned that raw power was rarely taken with noise. It was acquired in shadows, with carefully chosen words and loyal hands. Within minutes, messages were passed, aides summoned, and the first narrative began to form. Charlotte was tired, one source muttered to a tabloid contact. She's still learning her place. It was a subtle framing, but unmistakable. Camilla would not let the moment fester into scandal, not without control. The child was to be painted as innocent. The mother, however, would be another story. Behind the scenes, she gave quiet but firm instruction to trusted staff. Prepare a soft press rollout, one that reminded the public of her journey, her dedication, her rightful place. But it was only a veil. What she really sought was containment. She knew the press well enough to feed them just enough distraction. At the same time, she privately urged Charles to act not publicly, but decisively. "You must speak to Catherine," she said in a voice colder than protocol. "She's endangering the hierarchy." It was a demand born from a fear she dared not voice that Catherine's calm resistance had already shifted the palace's center of gravity. Camilla never forgot the years she was labeled the villain. She wore that title like armor now. But she also understood that the court of public opinion was fickle. Catherine, with her pristine image and unwavering poise, was everything Camilla had once been denied. And now her daughter had embarrassed the queen in front of the entire family. To Camilla, this wasn't an isolated act of rebellion, it was coordinated, perhaps even deliberate. The deeper pain wasn't in Charlotte's refusal, but in Catherine's quiet endorsement. The smile, the hand on the arm, the message sent across the table like a dagger hidden in silk. Camilla had seen enough to know when a war was being declared. The retaliation was methodical. Behind closed doors, future event lists were reviewed. Camilla questioned whether Charlotte should be present at the next high-profile engagement, suggesting she might be too young to handle the spotlight. It wasn't punishment, it was control disguised as protection. If Catherine noticed, she said nothing. That silence only fueled Camilla's urgency. She needed backing. So she turned to allies she had long cultivated, Anne and Sophie. Women who understood the sacrifices of palace life. Women who, if persuaded properly, could reinforce the structure Camilla felt was slipping. Her appeals were cautious, wrapped in the language of decorum and tradition. To Anne, she positioned Charlotte's act as a dangerous precedent. To Sophie, she alluded to Catherine's growing independence as isolating. Whether they bought into it or not didn't matter, not immediately. All Camilla needed was enough uncertainty to stall any rising wave of sympathy for Catherine and Charlotte. Control wasn't seized in full, it was maintained in increments. One headline, one exclusion, one shifted opinion at a time. The palace remained quiet publicly, but behind the scenes, a chessboard had been laid out and Camilla had moved her first pieces. But just as Camilla made her move, a figure long considered neutral stepped into the arena with an unexpected stance. Princess Anne rarely weighs in on palace drama, but when she does, the family listens. And this time, she didn't mince words. What she said behind closed doors stunned even Charles. Because Anne didn't just defend Charlotte, she warned Camilla. While others at the table exchanged uneasy glances or feigned composure, Anne observed everything with her signature silence, a silence that was never passive. She had spent her life mastering the art of restraint, but tonight, she saw something that cut deeper than decorum. Charlotte's refusal wasn't just a child's outburst, it was a mirror of the past. And in Camilla's reaction, Anne saw a repeat of the same brutal dynamics that once destroyed Diana from within the palace walls. Later that night, she asked for a word with her brother, and Charles, used to Anne's blunt assessments, wasn't prepared for the blow that followed. "You're repeating history," Anne said, her voice devoid of theatrics but heavy with consequence. "And this time, you won't recover as easily." She reminded him how Diana's suffering had been dismissed, how warnings were ignored until it was too late. Now, another generation was showing signs of fracture, and it was starting from within the walls Charles swore to protect. Anne was not one for sentiment, but her loyalty to the integrity of the monarchy ran deeper than titles. And what she saw in Charlotte's eyes was not rebellion, it was a cry for justice. One that echoed from Diana's legacy through Catherine's silence, and now lived in Charlotte's courage. She didn't stop there. Anne took a rare and public step toward Catherine, not with words but with presence. She made it known to the household that Catherine's choice to support her daughter was not only valid, it was necessary. Privately, she expressed admiration. "There's strength in restraint," she said to a close aide, and Catherine showed more tonight than many ever have. It wasn't just maternal solidarity. It was a royal recognizing another's quiet war. And Anne, hardened by decades of watching women in the family break beneath pressure, wasn't willing to let it happen again without resistance. Her words to Charles were sharp, but her warning to Camilla was even sharper. "You lose the children, you lose the crown. That phrase hung in the air like prophecy, because Anne understood what Camilla seemed blind to public approval no longer hinged on lineage alone. It was earned through perception, through emotion, through humanity. And right now, the public was watching. A queen offended by a child is one story. A queen seen as punishing a child is another altogether. The tides of public sentiment could shift with a single photograph, a single look, a single exclusion. And Anne wasn't about to let Camilla, or anyone else, provoke that shift unchecked. Charles didn't argue. He didn't defend. He simply sat, stunned, as if the ground beneath him had suddenly revealed its cracks. Anne's words had landed where no royal briefing could reach into the heart of a man who had spent his life building an image now threatened by the consequences of silence and misjudgment. She left him not with advice, but with a burden. The weight of choosing between defending the crown's traditions or saving its future. The dinner may have ended, but the true fallout was just beginning, and it was Catherine who held the next move. In the days that followed, the palace was no longer quiet. Meetings were called, statements withheld, and at the center of it all was Catherine, graceful, poised, and no longer silent. For years she'd played the role of dutiful daughter-in-law. Now, she was becoming something more, the monarchy's true center of gravity. While the courtiers scrambled behind closed doors to interpret what had unfolded at the family dinner, it was Catherine who moved with purpose, without needing permission. She said nothing to the press, issued no clarifying comments, and gave no rebuttal to the whispers. But her silence was not weakness, it was command. Within the walls of the palace, her presence carried a different weight now. Royal staff, once rigid in their deference to hierarchy, began turning to Catherine for guidance, not because they were instructed to, but because they instinctively recognized where the authority had begun to shift. Where Charles and Camilla appeared increasingly withdrawn, Catherine stepped in not with power grabs, but with quiet, assured presence. She met with William privately, not to soothe him but to strategize. Together they reviewed upcoming engagements, mindful of how to balance tradition with the new reality that Charlotte had set into motion. At the same time, Catherine reached out to Princess Anne, again not in defiance, but in unity. The two women shared a conversation that lasted hours, the kind of dialogue that doesn't happen unless there is deep trust. And then came the most unexpected meeting of all, an invitation for tea with the Archbishop. That alone sent waves through the palace, not for its content, but its timing. Catherine wasn't merely reacting anymore, she was planning. Outside the gates, the public responded in waves of quiet admiration. Social media, often a volatile landscape, had taken Charlotte's gesture and Catherine's reaction as symbols of courage. Posts began to appear praising the Princess of Wales for supporting her daughter's emotional intelligence. Images of Charlotte, previously filtered through the lens of youth, were now being analyzed for strength. The public didn't just see a mother, they saw a leader. And the palace, for all its tradition, began to feel that change pressing inward. Charles and Camilla, once the central figures in every royal equation, now found themselves increasingly on the outskirts. Their public appearances were met with tepid applause, their statements scrutinized for subtext. There were whispers that Camilla had pushed too hard, that her need for deference had created a fracture that could not be mended with protocol. And as those murmurs grew, Catherine stood undisturbed, speaking only when necessary, always calm, always controlled. Without lifting a finger, she had become the nucleus of a quiet revolution. It wasn't official, no titles had changed. But among those who understood the palace's true mechanics, something had become undeniable. The matriarchal undercurrent once anchored in duty alone now flowed through Catherine. She was not a rebel, nor a radical, but a stabilizer. She offered the institution a way forward that didn't require suppression but transformation. And while others panicked about optics and headlines, Catherine focused on something deeper. Influence without noise, loyalty without fear, and leadership without ego. It was no longer about Camilla versus Catherine, or tradition versus change. It was about survival. And the monarchy, in its quietest moments, had begun to pivot not around a throne, but around a woman who understood both its burdens and its future. But before the dust could settle, another royal shockwave threatened to break the fragile balance once more. In the quiet of her bedroom, Away from palace walls and royal protocols, Princess Charlotte whispered the words that would haunt Catherine. "Mummy, I don't trust her. No cameras, no curtsies, just a child, telling her truth." And for Catherine, it was both a warning and a prophecy. The night after the storm of silence at Windsor, with the palace still humming with whispered interpretations and calculated calm, Catherine tucked Charlotte into bed. There were no lectures, no questions, just a long, deliberate silence that wrapped around them both. But children are never truly silent. Their emotions find ways to escape. And when Charlotte looked up with wide, tired eyes and said those 7 words, Catherine felt her heart twist. "Mummy, I don't trust her." It wasn't said in rebellion. It was said in fear, in weariness, in knowing far too much for a child of her age. Charlotte didn't need to say the name. Catherine knew exactly who she meant. Charlotte spoke in fragments, little observations gathered over years. How Camilla looked at her, how her name never came up unless it was about rules or behavior. She mentioned overheard conversations, the way adults sometimes pretended she wasn't listening. She asked questions that didn't belong to childhood, about who gets to wear crowns and why some people are loved while others are feared. Catherine listened, her throat tight with guilt. Not because Charlotte had spoken out of turn, but because everything her daughter said echoed truths Catherine had swallowed for years. And now, her daughter was carrying a burden she hadn't been old enough to inherit. Catherine wrapped her arms around Charlotte and held her longer than usual. She didn't have the answers, not the kind that could soothe or simplify. But in that embrace, she offered what generations of royals had often failed to give validation. She didn't dismiss Charlotte's fears. She acknowledged them. And in doing so, she acknowledged her own. She told her daughter, softly, that the world they lived in was complicated, that truth and loyalty weren't always the same thing, and that being royal sometimes meant standing quietly in storms others couldn't see. But she also promised her that no crown, no title, no tradition would ever matter more than her peace of mind. It wasn't just a mother's comfort. It was a vow. As Charlotte fell asleep, Catherine sat beside her, unable to look away. She thought of everything that had led to this moment. The years of playing by the rules, of smiling through slights, of protecting her family by bending herself out of shape. She had hoped her children could live differently, freer, safer. But that hope was slipping away, replaced by a cold understanding if she didn't shield them, the monarchy would mold them, and not kindly. That night, she decided something no royal decree could undo. She would protect her children from the palace, even if it meant challenging everything the palace stood for. Morning light crept into the room as Charlotte stirred. She walked to the window and stared out at the gardens, her small frame still but composed. There was something in her eyes that had changed, no longer just the innocence of a child, but the quiet formation of resolve. She hadn't just observed power, she had felt its consequences. And Catherine knew deep down that her daughter wouldn't forget. Nor would she forgive easily. The monarchy had faced scandals, abdications, and betrayal, but now, its greatest reckoning might come from within its youngest heir. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.